So this is the second video where I'm trying to offer a couple of quick tips to maybe improve your responses to question 1 in history extension. And remember, these aren't necessarily, as I've said, the golden ticket to a band 6. They're just simply some things you might think about as you're preparing and practicing over the coming months for the history extension exam for you to improve your responses. So you need to always think critically, have a look at the samples, have a look at the notes from the marking center, and continue to try to refine this. Probably with history extension, it's the case that there isn't one clear, simple strategy to writing a good essay. So this needs to be something that you practice and work through to get to the point where you're actually really confident with it. In a sense, it's a bit like your major work. You don't just kind of do the first draft and hand it in. You need to actually practice it and refine it so that you're comfortable with the process and that you're comfortable having produced some good essays so that you know what it takes and what they look like and what they feel like to produce. So there's a lot here for you to do in the process of developing these essays that are strong. And the other point to mention here is the fact that it is quite a personal subject, in the sense that the sources that you use, but also the claims that you make about history, are very much your own. So you can't just sort of look at the samples and say that's what I'll say, because you don't know what the question is, you don't know what the source is. You have to be prepared and confident in your own views about these things. So let's have a quick look at strategy 2. If you remember strategy 1, I suggested that you think about a sophisticated and critical way to approach the source as you discuss or develop your discussions. That was more than just referring to it. You really need to critically engage with it in a sustained manner. The second strategy that I want to suggest to you is actually about your sources, making sure that your sources that you're prepared to discuss allow you to actually say a lot about history. So you might remember we've been looking at this general kind of, and very basic, I might add, sort of summary of the history of history, 3 periods: pre-Enlightenment, the Enlightenment era, and not necessarily the post-Enlightenment era, but you could think about this as perhaps the postmodern era. Okay, so pre-Enlightenment, and then working our way towards basically the present day in the early 21st century. And the main story that we've been kind of, in a sense, coming back to is that really history had no organizing principle here. It was really anybody's game. There were no universities controlling how history was done on a large scale. And what happened in the Enlightenment, or as a result perhaps of the Enlightenment, is we got this narrowed version of what good and legitimate history was. Remember, this is not saying that other people didn't do history in all their own kind of ways in this period. It's saying the dominant form of what was understood as legitimate and real and proper history was really controlled by the professionals around this idea of disciplinarity. And so what we got as a result were the most important, perhaps, or that was at least the claim, the most legitimate historical works were published elite works of history, often multi-volume, I might add. So you can think of von Runcker and Elton and Carr and Marxist historians and stuff really becoming quite important in this period. And what we said as well is, following that idea of Daniel Wolfe, Global History of History, is that history has become increasingly fragmented as of the late 20th century, mainly because of things like postmodernism, the rise of new digital technologies, and the social and economic changes that are going on in many parts of the world, increasing middle classes, the spread of higher education, and other things like that. More people are participating in history, and also more people are being written about or talked about and discussed in history. So one positive reading might be that it's democratized. A negative reading might be that your historical professionals, history professionals, are losing their say and losing their contribution. Now, that might be a good thing, you could actually argue. So be prepared to discuss these issues as we go. Now, the point that I'm making here with strategy 2 to improve your responses to question 1 is that I'm trying to point out that you need to be prepared to maybe discuss a range of sources from this, so that you can reflect, in a sense of how history has changed over time. That's part of perhaps what you could do. And there are some important questions here. To what degree has history changed? Well, obviously the way history is produced is changing quite quickly in the digital age, but is it actually fundamentally changing what history is about is an interesting question. perhaps in a sense history is actually being democratized now in a similar way to it actually in a similar way to what it actually was back here in the pre-Enlightenment period, where anyone could really participate in it. Perhaps you could actually say that there are strong continuities going on here, as well as strong changes that are taking place. So history's always been really a debate. We're worried here about who gets to discuss history and who are the best people, who are in the best position to discuss history. And many people would say that it's professionals. Okay, back here, many people would say that it wasn't necessarily professionals, but people who had the time and the sources to actually create it. So if you think of someone like Thucydides here, he was very much of the opinion that to create good history, you had to write it very much only based upon what the sources would allow you to say. And that's, in a sense, that's a strong continuity with what a lot of people are arguing down through the ages. So there's a question here: to what degree has it changed? Certainly there's some changes, but I think a more sophisticated reading of history would see that there are some of the same big questions that are basically being debated in new contexts throughout this period as well. The other point that I want to make in terms of your sources is, as I've suggested a number of times, you want to be prepared to discuss a variety of sources, not just historians, not just a particular kind of historian. You want to be able to discuss a range of different kinds of commentators. You might think of sources as commentators on history. So if we're looking here, you might include things like Herodotus, you might include Thucydides. They'd be very up for grabs here, and I think they'd be very relevant to study a couple of these. You might also discuss, if your preparation has led you in this direction, a particular example of mythology and how it actually allowed people to, say, use history as a way of developing some sense of identity. That might be something that you could pick up on here. You could pick up on a particular group's mythological kind of stories and how it was actually used as a type of history. And you could discuss that. That's totally legitimate if you want to prepare for that. I'm not suggesting that you do, I'm just pointing out that it's a wide scope. Secondly, if we're looking at this period here, you might want to choose to discuss one of the big names. So someone like von Ranke. And it makes sense here because von Ranke did, and people like him, did have such an important influence on the way history was seen in this period. So picking up on one of the big names wouldn't hurt. But also I should point out with these, Elton and Carr is another good example of this. I'm not warning you away from this at all, but also pointing out that many other students will be writing about these too. And also the markers will know a lot about these, probably. So you don't want to go in underprepared if you're going to discuss these. By all means, go in and discuss them, but if you want to discuss them, you need to make doubly sure that you're really prepared to discuss them in some good detail. Finally, here you might think about some of the alternative groups here that developed under this period, where you might think of the Annales school, who challenged the kind of empiricist approach by suggesting that history was not just about documents, but it should be about the past. And so they challenged people like von Ranke for being too narrow in their view of how history could function. You also had theoretical developments, people saying that history could not be understood just by sources alone, that we needed actual theories about the world to help us interpret all of that. So you had Marxist historians of a great variety, and you had feminist historians as well developed here of a great variety again. So I'm not suggesting you see these as one simple group, but perhaps select an example of these groups. And these are already pointing towards this fragmentation that's going on, that history is no longer about elites. It's actually about the average people. So Marxists pretty much focusing very much on things like history from below, and obviously feminists doing the same, looking at marginalized groups and trying to write them back into the histories that we tell. And finally, if we look at this last period, we're bringing ourselves up to the present day and looking at some of the more recent developments in historiography. You might think here, this is obviously not new, but postmodernism would, I think, be a very appropriate theme or issue to discuss here, or a postmodernist historian. So you might discuss the school at large, the general thought pattern, or you might choose to discuss one particular historian. You might choose, in some sense, to discuss both. You also, I think, might think of some of these larger, these new longue durée stories that are coming up here. The two best examples I can think of are Big History by David Christian and the History Manifesto, which was a book freely published in 2014 that argued that historians could make a fundamental contribution to modern society, particularly by looking at larger scales of time. And also, you might think of a text like Nigel A. Raab, who is the historian, in which he discusses in, I think, chapter 4 or 5, history in the digital age. That's a very specific part of a book that you might take into an exam to be able to discuss some of the major themes. So they're just an example of some of the different things that you might prepare for. What I would also suggest about your sources is that you go back to those key questions on page 12 and 13 of the syllabus. So notice I'm dragging this up from the syllabus here, that it suggests students learn about what is history by using the case study, but in this context, we're more interested in the key questions. Okay, so the source book of readings is not mandatory, it's just one suggestion where you could get source material. But the important emphasis here is on the following questions. When you're developing your notes on your sources and your historians and your commentators, come back to these key questions because you need to be ready to discuss relevant parts of this. So what are the historical debates? What debates were they commenting on? And notice here you're required to look at recent historiography, hence that last column with big history and Nigel Raab are important. Popular interpretations and perspectives of the issue, so not just academics. Changing approaches to the construction of history, so how history has been written about or developed, I suppose, constructed in different ways over many years. Who are the historians? Looking at different historians. Be prepared to discuss, if it's relevant, their biographical details, their personal ideologies, their philosophies of history, and how they actually approach their construction of history. Think also of their context, their gender, their class, their ethnicity, when and where they wrote, okay, their social and economic structures that were around them at the time. Were they living under a liberal democratic regime, or were they living under, say, a monarchy? That might have an influence on how they developed their ideas. What are the purposes of history? So looking at the aims and purposes of specific works. So if you're looking at von Runke, don't just talk about generally his ideas. At some point, you might need to be prepared to discuss something specific about one of his particular works. Or if you look at, say, for example, that book, the History Manifesto, what are the aims and purposes of that? It's a very specific work, okay? Jump down here to have a look at how history has been constructed, how historians change in terms of the methods they use. Now, Nigel A. Raab's History in the Digital Age is a great example of a source that discusses the changing methods of historians. It's also interesting that he doesn't actually come to a specific conclusion on some issues, but rather says it's yet to be seen a little bit what the digital age will actually do to the role of history and to the methods of historians. So the forms of historical communication, be prepared to look at how written, oral, visual, audiovisual, and multimedia sources will affect the meaning of a particular work. Also the types of history. Then also reflect on some of these big questions about why history and approaches to history have changed. The availability of evidence, the personal context of historians, the changing interpretations and perspectives, and the changing philosophies of history. So when you're preparing your sources, you need to be preparing them to discuss a wide range of things. That means your notes really need to have specific detail in them so that in an exam you can bring out that specific detail where relevant and develop a very detailed analysis linked to the source and the question.